the end of this long weekend. So we're going to talk about trees. We all know trees are really important. As humans and mammals, we have this beautiful relationship with trees that we don't often acknowledge, where they exhale what we inhale. They're the lungs of the planet, and they take this atmospheric carbon and put it into their trunks and their limbs and into the soil. They also feed pollinators, birds, provide habitat, shade in these hot times we're in. And there's been kind of a lot of talk at the conference about how they're part of restoring the water cycle, and they actually can cause the rain to fall. Yeah. So also trees are at risk. We all know that. This year there's already been 5.5 million acres that have burned in the U.S. this year alone in 40,000 forest fires. And trees, a lot of trees are drought stressed and succumbing to insects. And trees are being logged across the world at an alarming rate, which we'll talk about a little more with our speakers. So we know there's a lot of problems, but we're all here today to talk about some solutions at this conference. So we have these 4 incredible panelists that are going to speak to us today on a variety of things, from forest defense to reforestation, a little bit of agroecology, and some tree care. And we're going to have lots of time for questions at the end, so just remember your questions after each speaker, and we can have Q&A at the end. All right, so our first speaker is going to be Karen Hull. I'll put this on. You want to do it? Okay. All right. So Karen is a professor of environmental studies at UC Santa Cruz. Her work focuses on local and landscape processes and how they affect ecosystem recovery from human disturbance, and uses this information to restore damaged ecosystems. Her current work, which she's going to tell us about, focuses on rainforests in Latin America. She oversees long-term tropical restoration studies around the world, including some in California. She sits on many different boards and is really influential in the field. And she's going to tell us all about her work now.
Okay, so thanks. So, as Hannah said, I do work in California, but today I'm going to be talking about my work in tropical forests. In tropical forests. So, I like to start, even though I work in restoration, talking a little bit about forest dynamics. And one thing we know is that there's forest being lost and gained. And so, during the period of this study, it was done about 2.3 million, I gotta get my number here, 2.3 million square kilometers of forest were lost, and so those are areas that are red, but we also are gaining forests, and in a lot of places we're both losing and gaining forests. And those dynamics are really important, particularly in the tropics, because when we lose forests, we lose biodiversity. We also, it has a huge effect on carbon. About 10 to 12% of carbon dioxide emissions are from loss of forest, primarily in the tropics, but we also know that they can potentially be important carbon sinks. And it also has important effects on human livelihoods, the people who live and use those forests. And so the most important thing we need to be doing, besides even though I work in restoration, is to stop the drivers of deforestation. And so really thinking about what those are and how we can make a difference. Things like beef, logging, but more recently a lot of the forest clearing that's happening in the tropics is for the expansion of soy, and then huge areas are being cleared for oil palms. And even though my own research and what I do really focuses on how to restore forests, absolutely the most important thing we have to do is to keep the existing forest standing. Because one thing we know in restoration is that we cannot get exactly what was there back before. It takes a long time, it takes a lot of money, and we're never going to get it all back. And so sort of like Humpty Dumpty, it's a lot harder to pull them, it's a lot easier to break it than it is to put it back together. So I just like to always start with that. So forest restoration alone is not a solution. We have to keep the forest standing. But one of the things that is exciting is that there are very large global targets that are being set for forest, it's called forest landscape restoration. So the Bond Challenge in 2011, 150 million hectares of forest they're aiming for by 2020. That's only 33 years from now. And then the New York Declaration of Forests is 350 million hectares by 2030. And there's a lot of debate about whether these are feasible targets. There's also some debate because some of this map from the World Resources Institute actually has people planting forests in areas that are ancient grasslands. And so we do want to restore forests, but we do not want to be doing it at the expense of other ecosystems. But the bottom line is that there is a lot of interest in very large-scale forest restoration at the global scale. And that's also at the regional scale. I just came back from Brazil. There's a lot of talk about the 2020 initiative, which is to try to restore 20 million hectares of forest in Latin America by 2020. And in the Brazilian Atlantic forest, which is highly deforested during the time of the Portuguese, they're aiming for 15 million hectares by 2030, in the next 30 years. But the question is, how do we restore forest at that scale, given that we have limited resources and we have to balance human needs? And that's what I think a lot about in my research. So one of the ways that we can restore forests, and the easiest way, is to allow for natural recovery of those systems. And we know that some forests actually recover pretty quickly. So this is dry forest in northwestern Costa Rica that's about 15 years old. It's naturally regenerated. This is shifting agriculture in the Yucatan Peninsula. That's about 3 years after it was used. Huge amount of regeneration. But it's not always the solution. There's also lands like this. This is an area of land in the Panama Canal, 10 years of no management, and it's incredibly dominated by these aggressive pasture grasses. So there's a huge range in how fast tropical forests can recover, but to date, the largest area of land of sort of restored forest of the tropic has naturally regenerated. We also know that the most common type of restoration that is done is planting trees, and increasingly planting native trees. That can be a really good strategy because it helps to enhance seed dispersal. Most tropical forest seeds are dispersed by birds and bats, so if you get more trees, you get the seed dispersers back that bring more species back. It also helps to shade out pasture grasses and moderate the microclimate conditions, so it gets rid of that competition. However, tree planting is not always the solution. It can create homogeneous conditions if you're planting in lines. It's quite costly to plant and maintain. And it's not always the best strategy. It depends on the ecosystem. This is a site in the Brazilian Cerrado, which is a savanna system in the center of Brazil. There's actually, this is a 6-month-old abandoned pasture, and you can already see the trees resprouting. My colleagues there have done research, and what they found is if you go and plant trees, you actually damage the regeneration process of the species that are resprouting because you're digging holes and you're damaging that. So it actually is a better strategy to let the trees come back on their own and then direct seed other species. So I guess my message there is that sometimes people get a little over-exuberant about tree planting, and sometimes it's a good strategy, but we really need to think about the ecosystem and how the ecosystem works and then design our restoration strategy to the ecosystem. So there's restoration strategies go from sort of a more passive approach of just allowing for natural regeneration to increasingly putting more and more active resources in there. And what sort of a strategy we take in tropical forest, I would say in any forest, first of all, you need to know how resilient the ecosystem is. Will it come back on its own? You need to know how degraded the land is. We know consistently that lands that have been used extensively for cattle recover much more slowly than those that have been used for a short-term period of time for shifting agriculture. It also depends on the landscape context. So, are there sources of seeds around that are going to recolonize, or is it this really open areas in Brazil? It also depends on what the goal of the project is and what resources are available. So if we're going to move and we're going to think about sort of how do we intervene, then we need to think about, how are we going to do this at a large scale if we're going to try to do it at this hundreds of millions of hectares. And so this is something I've been thinking about in my limited time. I'm just going to talk about a few examples. But what we really need to be doing in the tropics, and I would say elsewhere, is to include different stakeholders and trying to align the research with the practice of restoration. Kind of what do we know about the system, and then what do we know socially about what the different needs of the people are, and trying to come up with some creative solutions. Because if we're going to do this at a large scale, we definitely have to be thinking about how are we going to work together and what type of solutions do we have. So I'll just talk about a few examples of what I think are some creative solutions that are starting to think about that include both humans and the ecology. So one thing that's being promoted quite a bit is the idea of silvopastoral systems. And then the marine system we heard, and absolutely we should be eating lower on the food chain, and that should be ideal. But that's probably not happening at the global scale immediately. So it's thinking about how can we find some sort of a win-win, and in this case, cattle grazing. And so what they're doing a lot, and this is happening in Colombia and some other Latin American countries, is to use silvopastoral systems, which are agroforestry arrangements that combine fodder plants with legumes and shrubs. And the idea is that you increase the productivity of the cattle in these systems, you create a better habitat for at least more structure for birds and bats and other types of wildlife in there, but you're also providing income to the farmers. And so, and the idea is that if you have these landscapes like this, you want to increase the productivity where you're producing it, enhance the provisioning of environmental goods and services like, water quality, but then taking some of these areas out of production, creating riparian buffer strips and some of these really steep slopes and pulling those out of production and thinking about how to manage at the landscape scale. And so one of my PhD students is working in a system in Colombia where the farmers received payments to improve their cattle management 10 years ago, and now what she's really doing is critically evaluating how successful has it been. So she's doing GIS studies of how the land, the forest cover has changed, looking at how the forests are regenerating in certain areas, and also looking at how the farmers' attitudes have changed towards this type of a system. So that's one example of some type of work. And this is actually being scaled up quite a bit in Colombia across quite a few different regions that they're doing this. Another area where they're doing really large-scale tropical forest restoration is in the Atlantic forest in Brazil that I mentioned. This whole picture here is a 300 hectare, and for those of you, a hectare is about 2.2 acres, 2.4 acres. And so this is a quite large area here. This is a 7-year-old restored forest, you can see, and they're doing really interesting work where they're planting usually 60 to 80 species. And they have a pretty progressive forest law. Unfortunately, Brazil, like us right now, doesn't have the greatest government. So the enforcement of that varies regionally, but particularly in the Sao Paulo state, which kind of like California is a little more progressive, they're really doing a lot of work there. So they have these nurseries where they're producing, 1 million seedlings of a huge diversity of different seeds. This is my collaborator, Pedro Brancaleon, and he's doing some really interesting work, I think, of thinking about how do we pay for restoration at these really large scales. And one of the things he's been doing is working with the eucalyptus producers. Brazil is the largest producer of paper pulp that's largely eucalyptus. And yes, I know, as a crowd from California, the first time I saw it, you go, eucalyptus, this is absolutely the worst thing. How could we possibly be planting eucalyptus? But what's amazing in this system is eucalyptus is very different in this system. So this is an abandoned eucalyptus plantation, and you can see what the understory looks like. It doesn't look like the eucalyptus groves, at least near Santa Cruz where I live. There's a huge amount of regeneration in the understory. So his proposal is if you can work with the eucalyptus industry, the pulp producers, and you can interplant eucalyptus with native tree species, the idea is that you log them out after 5 to 7 years, you get some money, and that helps pay for restoration. And he's collected a lot of data looking at both abandoned eucalyptus plantations and then looking at some of these intercropping systems, and they don't seem to have the same problem with allelopathy here that we do, I think because they get a lot more rainfall, and there's actually a huge amount of regeneration. I went out and I couldn't believe it myself at first. And so this is what the plantation looks like. These are the native species. They go and they log, and it looks pretty much like a moonscape. 6 months later, it looks like that. So it's something that I think is a really, I'm not saying it's always the solution, maybe it's not always the best solution, but I think it's a really creative way to think about, okay, how do we do this economically? Okay. So just a little bit about my own research. I collaborate some in Brazil and Colombia. I do most of my work in Costa Rica. It's right on the southern part on the border here. It's in pre-montane forest, pretty hilly, mostly agricultural land. So what I've been looking at in my research is, as I said, if you plant trees in lines like this, it looks like, okay, it looks like a tree plantation. But what we know about natural recovery is that what generally happens is you have these little patches of trees that establish, and those trees attract other dispersers, and those spread over time. And so we call this in ecology the nucleation model of succession, because it's like these nuclei spreading. So my colleagues and I got this idea, well, maybe what we should do is we should plant islands or nuclei of trees. And so we've been testing the strategy where we've been doing this. We want to look at whether this better simulates natural recovery and whether it's less resource intensive. So we set up about 16 sites 14 years ago. We now have 12 left after 14 years, and we're looking at the long-term recovery. This is one of our plantations. We have 3 treatments, which are these 3 treatments. We either do nothing, we plant islands of trees, or we plant plantations. So this particular view this is one of our plantations here. This is the natural regeneration in the foreground. This is after 1 year. You can see a few little seedlings. This is the same site after 9 years. So things grow pretty fast. That's the person right there. What you'll also notice in the foreground here is that this is the natural regeneration. There's not a lot of natural regeneration happening in this system. It regenerates fairly slowly. Like I said, that's not always the case, but in our sites it is. So we have a dense canopy height here. Our tree islands look something like this after 3 to 4 years. They slowly spread, and the canopies join. And what we're finding is that even though we planted 25% of the area, by about 8 to 10 years after, they've spread to cover about 50% of the area. We've collected a lot of data over the years on tree seed growth, seed dispersal, germination, birds, bats, mycorrhizal fungi that form association with roots. I don't have time to talk about that, but this is my website, and there's lots of papers and summaries on there about that. But the short of what we're finding is that planting tree islands can work as a restoration strategy. We find that, whoops, I lost my figure there, so you're going to have to believe me here, that what this showed was that the seeds and the seedlings, they're much lower in the natural regeneration of native forest species, but they're almost identical in the island plantings and in the full plantings. So they enhance seed rain and seedling establishment to a similar degree. It creates a more heterogeneous environment. And it also has less of an effect on nutrient cycling if you don't plant a bunch of trees that have certain characteristics. So, but like I said, you can, I'd be happy to talk to you later. You can look at my website if you don't believe my statements here. And just a final note that we were starting a new project in Brazil that I'm excited about. This is partly what I was doing when I was in Brazil a couple weeks ago, is that we're actually trying to scale this up to 1 hectare plots, and we're trying planting either 25% nuclei islands or 50%, or my colleague thought it might make more sense to plant in strips because that's the way they do a lot of mechanical planting, so this might be a little more practical. It's a little easier to explain to farmers too. The island thing is a little bit, has some logistical problems. And so we just set this up, he just set this up this winter. We have 30 tree species in there, half are animal and half are wind dispersed. So I'm going to be excited to see, anytime you have a restoration strategy, you need to test it at different sites to see how applicable it is over a large scale. So in conclusion, we can't restore tropical forests entirely. So the first priority has to be protecting intact forests. But many tropical forests, as I said, are fairly resilient. And so I think there is a lot of hope that this is a potential strategy. One thing that we're starting to find, though, is that sometimes forests regenerate and then they're re-cleared. So it's important with these secondary forests to protect them once they start to regenerate. And there are some promising options to restore tropical forests at large scale that balance ecological and human needs. So thank you very much. So I know we have to go on to the next speaker. And again, there's my website. Or you can just Google my name and it's.
Do we ask questions in between, or do we?
I think you can wait till the end. So
Hold the end and just jot them down.
Okay.
Good.
Okay. Oops, did I just do that there? She's
Not for her, but for
we'll read it.
All right, so our next speaker is Georgia here. Georgia is a herbalist, farmer, activist, involved on many different fronts. She's traveled extensively and looked at kind of alternatives to the big ag system and put a lot of those into practice. Currently, she's involved with forest defense, which she's going to share with us. A lot of the problems that the forests are facing here in California and in the Pacific Northwest, and what people are doing to step up and protect our old growth forests. And yeah, we're just going to pull up some pictures and then we'll keep going on that. Anything else you want to say about yourself?
No, it's great.
Okay.
Can you help me? How do I get here?
Right? Enter full screen.
Is that it?
And then I think if we just go Oops, sorry guys.
Preview.
That's a quick preview.
Okay.
Uh-oh.
Oh, shoot. Ah!
Oh, this is fine. Yeah, okay. This is, no, which is the first one? Oh, don't, close your eyes, everyone. This one, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Do you want me to tap to the next one? Or you
That's
good doing
fine.
it?
It doesn't really, it's gonna
Okay.
be, yeah.
All right.
Cool.
Yay.
Hi. I'm gonna set my timer because otherwise I'll just like ramble on. Yeah, so I'm excited to be here. I feel a little misplaced in this panel. I don't have a PhD, but I'm speaking as a rural resident. I live up in Humboldt County, and there's 3 huge timber corporations that own most of the land in that area. So I'm just going to speak to the Humboldt region, to that region, but also I want to make note that like these devastation of our forests is happening all over California.
Do speak up.
Okay, I will try. Yeah, so I guess I'm gonna start here. Hannah mentioned the importance of our forests. In California, our forests, we depend on them for 75% of our drinking water here. The interesting thing about the Pacific Northwest and like Cascadia in particular, which Cascadia begins like in southern Humboldt County, there's a lot of studies that have shown that the Pacific Northwest has the ability to hold more biomass than even the Amazon forest. So we have an incredible responsibility here to the globe to protect these forests. So I'm going to make a case here that not only is it vital that we replant and that we do these restoration efforts, but it's also really important that we keep the forests that we have intact. There's a lot of statistics that talk about, it's hard to find an accurate statistic, but right now they talk about the old growth. We have like between 1 to 3% left, and it could be less than that. So right now, what we're fighting for is it's even smaller than this screen. This is a picture of an area in Humboldt County, in Trinidad, and this is what the clear cutting looks like. So California is an interesting state. It's different than Oregon and Washington in that California is almost all privately held timberland. So these forests that we rely on, the headwaters for a lot of our drinking water, these are all privately held lands. And California's gotten really good, the timber companies here have gotten really good at greenwashing. So they wouldn't call this a clear cut, but when you zoom out and you see the effects, it's hard to call this a healthy forest. I am feeling scattered. So we've all seen these pictures are pretty heartbreaking. This is in the same area up here, and this is what the forests are looking like. And this is a clear cut right next to an old clear cut next to an old clear cut, and the way they get away with doing this, they'll have these little they call them like little beauty strips in between. So that allows them on paper to make it look like they're not clear cutting as much as they actually are. But when you go into the forest, you see that. I think I am feeling scattered because but I think what I just want to talk about, I want to take the time to talk about today is the greenwashing that's going on with these timber companies, and also a specific campaign that I've been working on. So the 3 main companies in Humboldt County, it's Green Diamond Resource Company, Sierra Pacific Industries, and Humboldt Redwood Company. And they
are all certified in one board or another, Green Diamond and HRC. They are certified under the FSC certification, which is the Forest Stewardship Council. But they do clear cuts like this, and they log old growth. So it's, if you go on their website, on the Forest Stewardship Council website, their main objective is to sell wood. What they're doing is they're rebranding. They're just they're rebranding, but they're still doing the same thing. So currently there's a campaign going on in the Mattole watershed. It's in southern Humboldt County. It's between the Kings Range, if anybody is familiar with that area. And it's right on next to Humboldt Redwoods State Park. So this area has a long history of forest defense. People have been fighting to protect this forest since 1998. It was originally owned by Pacific Lumber, and hundreds of activists have gone out there, put their bodies on the line with tree sits and road blockades to protect this forest because it is incredibly ecologically important. This is the, that's not the picture. But yeah, so this is a good map. This is the region here that Humboldt Redwood Company wants to go in, and they want to cut old growth Douglas fir. It's super landslide prone, and what is the importance about this area in regards to the redwoods is that it's the fog belt to some of the biggest trees in the world. So, sorry, I'm scattered, but
You're fine. Yeah,
there's a lot of studies that show that redwoods sequester 3 times more carbon than any other tree, and so there's very little left. The redwoods in Humboldt Redwood State Park are some of the tallest and oldest in the world, and they depend on fog, moisture, for most of their moisture. They're already suffering a lot from the drought, but the reason we're fighting to protect, so the area in red is owned by Humboldt Redwood Company. It's privately owned, and they want to log that whole region. It would create a desert effect if they log that, because it's basic. Those old growth Douglas fir are that was magic.
Yeah.
Okay. How do I pull it back up? Okay, there it is. Ooh, cool. So that's just one of the reasons that we're fighting to protect this area. We don't want to, it has local ecological significance and global ecological significance because of the place that it's located. And then this is a map. It's kind of hard to see, but this is just an example. It's like a very, we can talk about the global, but this is on a small localized level. This region has been so hit by logging. It's still suffering, and so we're fighting to protect the last old growth that's left. This is like a dreamy picture of the Mattole, and you can see the tree sit all the way down there. So people have been out. People have been engaging in direct action out there to protect this timber company from logging. There's tree sits, there are road blockades. The community is super active because they have been working for 20 years to restore the area after Pacific Lumber has destroyed it. There's salmon coming back in the river. So there's a lot at stake here. Yeah, so other things that I wanted to talk about was like the greenwashing that HRC is engaging in. And so Humboldt Redwood Company also, the owners of Humboldt Redwood Company also own Mendocino Redwood Company, and they're owned by the Fisher family, which owns the Gap. So we're talking about like pretty evil people. And in total, they own 400,000 acres of redwoods in California, so they're one of the largest redwood landowners in the state. And they, even though they have this green certification, they are doing this thing called Hawkins Word in the name of restoration. In Mendocino County, they have sprayed 88,000 acres with imazapyr. To kill, they're trying to, are engaging in a practice to kill non-marketable trees, which are hardwood trees. So like madrone and tan oak and canyon oak and live oak, beautiful oak trees. That what they do is they will hack into it with an axe and then pump in this herbicide called, it's a imazapyr and a proprietary blend that we don't know what, but basically it kills the tree while it's standing, and then they let the tree die. It's cheaper for them to use these herbicides rather than to cut it, and then they just let the tree die, and all those herbicides get into the watershed, and it's heartbreaking to see. What they're trying to do is they're trying to convert these natural forests into tree plantations. So that's what's going on out in the Mattole. They're trying to log the old growth so that they can plant a Douglas fir Christmas tree plantation. Well, but that's what it feels. It's not a forest. They're not replanting forests. They're planting the stalk, is what they call it. So, sorry, I'm scattered. I just got out of the woods. But that's what's going on, and you know what? Just to wrap it up, I just want to say, you know, a lot of people, when I come down to the Bay, a lot of people are shocked when I tell them about clear cutting. People think that clear cutting is illegal. I talk to people and they think that cutting redwoods are illegal. But they're not. The timber wars also are not over. They are clear cutting at an alarming rate. And you know, I feel like it's imperative that, you know, if we want a livable planet, we have to protect our forests. And we have to stop clear cutting, and I think we have to stop cutting redwoods also. So that's my plea, and yeah. Thank you.
And Georgia, real fast, is there a website people can check out, or a way they can donate money or supplies to the campaign, or anything like that?
We have a Facebook page. It's called Save the Ancient Mattole.
Where's hear that?
Save the Ancient Mattole Forest.
Is there anything we could do, like pick the gap and?
Yes.
Yeah, but we have to be more.
Okay, I'll take this down.
Get in touch with.
That would be awesome.
Change it as we go.
It'd be great for.
Okay.
What would true people?
This one looks, this one? This one.
And they should
Okay.
donate the land, otherwise we're not gonna go there.
That's what.
Oh, that's just.
Type of thing. We should figure out.
All right. Well, we're going to have lots of time for discussion at the end. We have 2 more speakers. Next, I'd like to introduce Joyce Bluebird. She's has her PhD in geology, has worked on a lot of really important land restoration projects in the Bay Area, wetland restoration and native oak hillside restoration, and right now is involved with the Masonic home restoration that she's going to tell us about. She works with the math science nucleus with children, getting youth engaged in these restoration projects. And yeah, thank you for your presentation.
Well, I'm glad to be here. I must confess, though, prior to my doing all this restoration, I worked in the oil company. So, what happened was I worked over in Russia and in a lot of exotic places. And then when I had an accident and couldn't do that anymore, I go, why ain't I working here? And so it developed into developing a nonprofit where scientists worked in the schools. But in the late 90s, there was all of a sudden an environmental push, and a lot of government agencies were willing to spend money on restoration. Hence, our local school district had recommended having science and restoration work together. So this is that story. Right now, so I'm going to start with where we are now and kind of go back how we got there. Masonic Home is an old folks home in the hills of the East Bay. It has about 2,000 residents, and these guys produce a lot of food waste. 2.5 tons per week, okay, of food waste. Now, how do you get rid of food waste? Well, you offload it. And they started realizing that cost of offloading was getting to be about $4,000 a month and rising. So my friend from Richard Valley, who's a district supervisor, we started talking about ways in which to make that $4,000 go into creating a system that restored the 200 acres that they have there. And it's right next to Garin Park and Cal State East Bay. So we have a ready supply of college kids. We have a lot of, we have lots of areas. There's a total of about 1,000 acres that we want to reforest with this great idea of using food waste. So where are we working? We're in this area here, just in case you don't know, the South Bay. Fremont is an area, Fremont, Union City, Newark is the last areas in the Bay Area to really urbanize. And so we had a lot of streams. We have the Hayward Fault there that produces a lot of sag ponds in that area. So we have wetlands where you don't have wetlands in the North Bay. A lot of them have been kind of hidden away, where ours have. We're using the natural geology to get some of this water, because water is very needed, very needed. Okay, so our motto is restoration through education. We use more elementary kids and high school kids than anything else. We have involved the local schools to do restoration every Saturday at one of our sites. They develop the trees, so we don't buy them. We make sure we get the local seed bank. And we make the high school kids learn how to foster these activities. Now, composting. Composting is, I learned a lot doing this, but you got this food waste, you put it in a big area, you kind of rotate it once in a while, and it still stinks. In the South Bay, we have a big problem. We have an area called Noe Island. That's where everybody's putting their food waste. You guys don't know it, in about the next 5 years, almost everybody is going to have to put their food waste not in the landfill, not in the green waste. It has to develop a way in which food waste, because food waste is what produces the methane and all these other problems. It produces 2 minutes left.
No, this is 90 minutes.
Okay, wrong room. So we have to understand how you do composting. Everybody talks about worms and ants and putting them in a pile, but there's another way of doing it, and that's thermophilic. Using actinomyces, fungi, that can really start breaking it down quickly. Because if you're making 2.5 tons of food waste, and you want to use that as compost at the end of the week, how do you do it? You must have this thermophilic process. So we teach kids how to do it by having these small areas. That's how we teach people. We do a lot of composting workshops at one of our facilities. Now, but the story, I want to go back to how this began. In the 1990s, we got this Tule Ponds at Tyson's Lagoon. It's on the Hayward Fault. This is the oldest lake in the Bay Area. We know it goes back to 4,000 years because it has an active spring. The South Bay has a aquifer underneath, and so this has been around for a long time. It's the seismologically most studied area in the world because we can look at the sediments over 4,000 years. You guys have probably heard about Hayward Fault when it erupts. This is where we're getting all that information from. We worked with Alameda County flood control, and we created these constructed wetlands. We bounded with the natural wetlands, and we started planting. And this is in the days when I didn't know much about how to do that. So most of our trees died. We didn't know the soil was depleted, it was dry, when you planted, you had to irrigate. How in the world do you get this going? So we came up with and this just shows you, this is what it looked like in '97, this is what it looks like 2011. It is now an urban forest. We have so many trees now, we now have to cut them down or transplant them into other areas. And this is going to get to the Masonic home. But this is an area. We also use bioremediation by using tules, which takes out heavy metals. So we do a lot of other types of restorations other than trees. But now we are considered an urban forest. So with the appropriate understory. We have like a little corridor in Fremont where we get our native animals back. We have about 10 western skunks, about 20 raccoons living there. We have about 123 different species of migrating birds that stop here. So we went from nothing to this just biological diversity. And it has all to do with the trees.
How many years was that?
That was less than 20. Less than 20. Now, so we realized the key to this restoration was to use chips, wood chips. Most people, when you look at the carbon sequestration, they say chips is a negative. And we're developing ways to show it's not. If you use it correctly and you put it on, it creates an environment where you're keeping your water in and you're doing natural composting. So this brought us to, we figured that if we could use wood chips and within 10, 15 years get a forest growing, what could you do with
Human waste.
human waste? Yeah. Or food waste. Human waste is another, that's a whole other. They actually got that, they sell that. So human waste they sell, so, but this one is a problem. Food waste is a problem. So this is the Masonic home. In 1898, it was already deforested. A lot of people are just shocked to think that all of the East Bay Hills were forested at one time. When it used to be, especially the South Bay, an oak forest community.
Oak grassland.
Yes, it was oak grassland.
Oak grassland, no.
Yes, the creeks were forested, it was oak grassland, a lot of grassland.
Well, there was more trees. I'm a paleontologist. I will dispute that claim of no oak. Of it being just grassland. So, but anyway, going from there, and then we do it there. But this is what it looks like today. Okay? The Masonic home got lots of old folks up there. So what we're doing here is we have 200 acres. We're starting to do different strategies of a lot of thermophilic food waste. This is what it looked like when we started. Now we put in a green technologies. We started to put, this group died. This was our first, because Richard Valle wanted to have a party up there to show trees. So he made us plant these, even though I said it wasn't going to work. Then what we do now is, now we have a yurt right over in there. And this is our green technologies, where we put in 2 tons of food waste a week, 2 tons of carbon, which is just our wood chips, and then 2 tons of horse manure. There happens just to be a horse ranch next door who was illegally dumping it for years on the other side of the mountain where nobody could see that. But what we've done is we've even made a yurt up here, because this is pretty high up here. It was really windy. We got at-risk youth to start planting. It was just a whole project in getting as many people as we can go. This is what it looks like right now. We're working on an area, oh, and we also have to deal with cows. They rent up there, so we're trying to develop those, like you said, the little islands. We're doing different islands in different areas trying to get these trees higher. Because we have this major problem in the South Bay, not enough water. We can't just let it grow. And so this food waste is retaining that water. So this is what it's starting to look like. So the ecosystem is now changing. We now have enough worms growing. Before we had nothing growing. The soil was dissected by different types of rock type because of the Hayward Fault. And now we're really getting this soil going. So this is our composter. This is where we take out 1 ton, we put in, we take out about 4 tons, we put in 6 tons every week. So what we do is we start moving it around, and that's kind of what we're doing now. We're experimenting with high school kids, especially only during the winter season do we actually plant. We have, so when you look at all the process, you have to look at what you need and what you have. And so what we did was we just put it together and it's now functional. So this is again another closer look at it. Notice all the chips there. This is the horse stable with plenty of manure. And then that's what our food waste looks. Within 24 hours, it turns brown. Yeah, so it doesn't stink. It has that earthy smell. The actinomyces does their thing. And it's almost incredible. We take the food, we don't offload it, so we decrease our carbon footprint by using these little trucks that we hand and take the food waste from the kitchen directly on site. And so this is how we're trying to look at on-site composting where your carbon footprint is reduced. We also start, we have a tractor up there, we're putting things through the process. And then we use the California Nursery in Fremont. This is a historical park. They were the largest nursery on the West Coast in the 1880s up until 1960. This is where we plant our trees. The city of Fremont lets us work there, so we have hundreds of trees over there. And then this is how we plant. We just try to get some of Cal State East Bay professor here, Mike Macy, and we try to teach. He teaches several classes that we're trying to get systemic, so we always have this pool of kids.
So now we're at 2 minutes. 2 minutes.
Okay, and I am finished. Okay, so what worked and what did not? So we had some successes, we had some not, but this is some of the major problems that we didn't realize. The boar, well, my God, when they go around trees, it's awful. The turkey. Turkeys are actually not too bad. They get rid of all the other food waste that is left, and the deer kill our trees, never mind the cows. But the deer do a number on it. So this is just kind of, we're doing several projects, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Very inspiring. Next speaker is Alex Javier. Alex went to school for forestry, right? Studied forestry, has worked for various government forestry things, now works for Friends of the Urban Forest, which is going to share a lot of what they do as another kind of local way we can tap into tree planting. Used to work or works with Green Teens, which is the oldest teen.
Yeah, it's the oldest teen urban forestry paid vocational training program in the country, so it's pretty cool.
Yeah, so we're just going to pull up your thing. I have to do this now. Okay, there's a little clicker.
Well, okay, so do I do right,
you
left,
just
stop?
click, and then this is the thing if you
Cool.
want to use that.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. Since we had a very uplifting talk about restoration. I will have a little tangent because we're just talking about the Humboldt Redwoods. On a really sad tangent before I start, to add to George's thing about forest protection, forest defense, and how forest industry works up in Humboldt. One thing that is one of my major concerns that we can discuss later is the Green Diamond Redwood Company and how they have a specially bred one genotype of redwood that grows 50% faster. And if anyone knows how redwoods grow, once you plant a redwood in the ground, it grows, you can cut it down and it'll coppice out from the ground so you never have to replace it. So in some ways they are creating these super monocultures of the same genotype over tens of thousands of acres, which is really fun when we're talking about resilience and pest and disease in the future. Forest management is important, but I don't think monocultures are. But that's not really what I'm talking about. I just thought that was something that I was thinking about while George was speaking. So I'm here to talk about community forestry, and specifically urban forestry in San Francisco. And I can start with a little history of Friends of the Urban Forest. So if anyone has seen pictures of San Francisco from the 1970s, particularly along the streets, we have Golden Gate Park, we have Mount Sutro, Mount Davidson, which are large forested areas. But if you go along the actual streets, photographs from a long time ago show that there were almost no trees along the streets. So in 1981, this group of concerned citizens took direct action and started a nonprofit to have people help plant trees, go into the neighborhood, cut out the concrete, and that is still the same work that we do. We organize with community organizations as well as individual homeowners to open up sidewalk and put trees in the ground as well as maintain them. So you can see this is a picture of the first planting that we did in the Noe Valley area in 1981. That's 24th and Dolores. And then this is what it looks like. I think this was probably taken about 5 or 6 years ago. So after 30 years, we have trees. And I'll talk to you about why those trees aren't as big as the redwoods in a few moments. So some of our accomplishments is in March 2010 we had our 1,000th community planting where we get together, put trees in the ground, then have a potluck at the end, all with the help of volunteers within the neighborhood. We planted our 45th 1,000th tree in April 2011, and now we're actually on our 36th anniversary. So I think we're the second longest run community forestry and urban forestry nonprofit in the state of California after Tree People in Los Angeles. Not as exciting of a slide, and these are some of the programs that we do. So I was talking about our community tree planting, where we hit each neighborhood in San Francisco twice a year, so that we can have a dense group of a certain number of blocks where homeowners have buy-in and they say, I will water the tree and we will subsidize the cost of planting. We've actually planted 53,000 trees since 1981. Call that about 75% survivorship. There's 124,000 trees in San Francisco along the streets, so we are responsible for about 1/3 of the trees that you see when you're walking along the streets of San Francisco. On top of that, though, we discovered along the way that you can't actually just plant trees, you have to maintain them. Otherwise, you end up with structural integrity issues, as well as trees getting in the way of pedestrians or cars or breaking up sidewalks. So we've done a lot in adjusting our system over time to find the right tree for the right place, as well as we provide tree care for the first 3 to 5 years. And a lot of that is done. What I do is tree care and arboriculture for young tree training to give them good structure, particularly with volunteers, college interns, as well as our Green Teens Youth Employment Program, which has been going on since 1996, where we pay teens who are either in at-risk environments or already in risk in the system or come from low-income neighborhoods, where they can do a year-long program that gets them outside, gives them paid work, teaches them not only the physical skills and environmental skills of planting trees, analyzing watersheds and things like that, but also other things like how to talk to the homeowners, how to talk to the volunteers on resume building. So it's more than just planting trees, it's actually building community and building resilience, and that's kind of where my talk will go to. Other programs we have, our sidewalk landscaping program. So San Francisco is a harsh environment for trees. And there are some places because of power lines, because of the width of the sidewalk, because of the quality of the soil, or also because of the environment, the salt or the wind, trees cannot go there. But we have a program where we can put in sidewalk landscapes and gardens along the streets that are larger pieces of sidewalk that have been cut out, so that increases the infiltration of water into the soil, as well as provides pollinator pathways throughout the city. And then we also have outreach, advocacy, education, and policy making that have resulted in some really cool successes that I will share soon. So we have some pictures here. Let's see, that's this. So this is some tree schoolers coming to our tree yard to water our trees and learn about urban forestry and trees in general. This is community planting, where they're putting protection around the tree after the tree has been placed into the ground. This is a sidewalk landscaping project, so you can see we're cutting out, each project cuts out about 500 square feet to 1,000 square feet within a few blocks. And this was actually, this is a Green Team program. We had a community bicycle planting where we transported all the volunteers and tools with bicycles to partner with other organizations like the Bicycle Coalition and PODARE down in the South City. But San Francisco is still in somewhat of a dire state. So for some reasons, our canopy cover is still very low. So you think of San Francisco as a green city. It's a place where there's a lot of focus on the history of the environmentalism movement. There's a lot of money and power going into green industries, but partly because we have big buildings, partly because of the salt spray. If you look over, how many of you are from the Bay Area or live here now? So when you look over at the Marin headlands, you don't see too many trees, right? You see a couple little watersheds in the protected places. So you could think San Francisco used to look like that, and we're actually somewhat afforesting traditional, they were the coastal bald systems or the coastal scrubland systems, but also, 1 million people and all those big buildings are not natural, so what can provide the best benefits and psychological benefits for the residents now that we have totally adapted the system is kind of what we're working on. But we are number 17 out of the 20 top economic cities in the United States in terms of our tree canopy cover. We're at 13% compared to 21% in LA, 24% in New York, and 30% in Portland. And worst of all, the forest is in decline as we had poor policy around maintenance for a long time, so more trees were dying than were being planted each year. So we can look at this. This is the canopy cover in San Francisco. And you can see it is not evenly distributed. So we have the Presidio, which is a giant park, Golden Gate Park, giant park, Diamond Heights, west of Twin Peaks. This is all has large areas of eucalyptus forest. But if you look out here, we have the outer Sunset, outer Richmond that are very low, 5% canopy cover. As you look at it from a satellite image, that's partly due to, that's mostly due to the microclimates of the salty and sandy soil. But the east side of San Francisco is really good growing climates, right? We have bay soils that can be deep and have lots of organic matter, lots of clay. And so the main reasons that we have low canopy cover, well, downtown is because of the big buildings. But down here in the Bayview and the Outer Mission, Ocean View, Crocker, Amazon, those are historically immigrant communities and low-income communities. So the way that San Francisco policy worked for a long time was if you plant a tree, if there's a tree planted in front of your house, the homeowner is responsible for that tree's maintenance as well as the liability of that tree. So you can think that if you don't have a lot of money and a tree breaks a sidewalk and replacing the sidewalk costs a couple $1,000s, you're not going to plant a tree. A tree might fall on a car, that's a huge liability risk, and you have to pay for the arboriculture and maintenance, which is several $100s every couple years once the trees become mature. So we were very successful at increasing the canopy cover in the more affluent and wealthy neighborhoods in San Francisco, but it has been a challenge to work with the communities that see trees as more of a liability than an asset because of the economic realities associated with the risk of trees, because trees grow without consideration for humans, so we have to make sure that they are safe for our environment. So what could the citizens do? This is part of our outreach and advocacy work, where in 2006, 79% of San Francisco voters approved an annual budget of $19 million to maintain sidewalks and street trees. So before that, all of that cost fell on the homeowner. So we worked with all 12 district supervisors who unanimously supported our bill. We collected data with the city on the state of the urban forest, as well as had about 7 years of campaigning to make sure that this would go through. And now we have a budget to maintain those trees so that all of those areas that had more tree liability could potentially the city could absolve some of those risks, as well as maintain the trees in a healthy manner for the rest of San Francisco. And we also have a plan to add 50,000 trees by 2035. So anyone can come and plant and prune with our community planting days every other Saturday, and we have many workshops throughout the week. Then we also have days where we go out and collect data on citizen science to see what species we see in our trees, as well as our sidewalk landscapes. We have the advocacy and policy section talking about that proposition that we worked on, and grassroots and neighborhood organizing. Cool, that means I have 3 minutes left. To help get their neighborhoods involved and be motivated and mobilized around all of the different ways that we can make the city more sustainable and have higher canopy covers. And so why do we specifically work with street trees? Street trees provide various social and environmental benefits, e.g. reducing airborne particulates, absorbing stormwater runoff, buffering heating and cooling costs, decreasing human stress levels, increasing wildlife habitat stewardship, etc. I might go through the presentation and then show you. These are some really cool resources. Urbanforestmap.org actually shows you, it's a map of all of San Francisco that we help maintain the database for, and it shows you can go to a tree and it'll say this tree is this size, it is in this health, so you can expect this much of a carbon sequestration benefit each year, or you can also expect this much water sequestration each year. And I have some handouts that I can show you for that in a few minutes. Nature Within is through the University of Washington. It's a huge portal of hundreds of peer-reviewed articles that show both the social, economic, and ecological benefits of having urban forests and urban green spaces. So those are both really good resources to check out. And then the other benefit is it's not just about the air mitigation, climate mitigation in the air, it's also about mitigation in the water system. San Francisco is one of those cities that, the few cities on the West Coast that has a combined sewer stormwater system, so that winter storms can overflow the system and cause raw sewage to flow into the bay. So our street tree basins and sidewalk gardens not only slow the rate of water hitting the ground and flowing into those storm drain systems, but they also create openings for that water to be infiltrated into the ground and recharge the aquifer, rather than going through the sewage system and overwhelming our combined system. So you can see there's an example of a sidewalk garden. Usually a street tree basin is about 3 by 3, so 9 square feet, versus in this case, we're talking more in the 20 to 30 to even 50 square feet as we accumulate those benefits. But we have a lot of ongoing challenges. Like I said, it's a hard life for a street tree. You don't have very much access to nutrients in your roots because there's all this concrete around you. You're stuck in this little box. People are breaking off your limbs, you're surrounded by smog, there's buildings shading you. In San Francisco, there's salt and there's wind. So about 20% of our trees die within the first 3 years of the establishment period. And that compares to about 5% in other urban areas.
You're at 15 minutes.
Okay. And I guess we can talk about those other things later. The one thing that I will say though is in terms of environmental justice and gentrification and community involvement is that has been a key challenge. As you know, one of the benefits of green spaces is they're more livable cities, and that tends to increase property value, which is a big problem as it changes the populations who were originally seated in those neighborhoods, and can make the neighborhoods more palatable for higher income residents. And while it creates all these benefits for people in that neighborhood, it also can become a catalyst to push the original residents out. So that is something in terms of public policy and urban forestry as a whole system that we are working on to be more aware of how these cascading effects impact the environmental justice issues that we're actually trying to combat in our efforts. So with that, every tree still matters because it gets people involved in direct action and stewardship. They can go back and see the trees that they planted many years down the line and be actual residents and have agency in the city that they live. So I think every tree is important, even if we don't have nearly as many trees as any big piece of the forest that the wildland foresters were talking about earlier.
Awesome.
Thank you. And I will pass this around. I only have 30 copies, but this will show you. This is just calculated for 3,700 trees, so about 3% of San Francisco's canopy cover, but it shows you how much those trees do for environmental mitigation within the city. So you can pass it that way. You can pass it these.
All right, thank you. That was great, Alex. So I'd like to invite all the panelists to sit up here, and now we can have some discussion. And Joyce, would you like to sit up here? I see a hand right here. Okay, and you'll be next, and then you'll be after that.
So I
Okay.
guess this question, I'll open it up to everyone, but I think it might be more appropriate for Gordon and Karen to answer. But I came across a few months ago an organization called Archangel Ancient Tree Archive, and a man named David Millard, doing these cloning and replanting of redwoods into new areas. And I'm curious if you're familiar with this, or if you're aware of what it is, and if you could give me any insight on it.
I'm not familiar.
Really? Okay, that's it. Okay. So essentially what he's doing is cloning redwood trees that would be able to survive.
You're talking about the old growth ones.
The old growth ones, yes. So he's cloning old growth trees and then replanting them into areas that don't currently have redwood forest, where hopefully they'll have more exposure to fog because as climates are changing. So he's trying to move redwood forest up towards Oregon. And I'm not sure how that works. He's a guy who had an incredible near-death experience. He came out of it, wanted to save the redwoods, and this is what he's doing. So if you're not familiar with it, then I'll definitely have to do a little more research, but I wanted to take this opportunity to ask some experts about what it looks like when we're trying to clone trees and put them into new areas that haven't traditionally been harboring a redwood forest. If that's a good thing or...
Well, there's a huge debate in the restoration literature. It's usually called assisted migration or managed translocation, and should we be trying to move trees in advance of climate change? The timber, in the academic community, people are debating it. In the world, people are doing it. The timber industry in British Columbia is looking at that right now. So that's, I'd say, a bit more of an ethical issue. You know, like you have to decide what do you think we should be doing on that, or do we let sort of species move on their own? And I don't come down strongly on either side. And that one thing you probably heard of a couple of us sort of, you think we're saying the same thing. I work on grasslands too. San Francisco with probably dunes. You know, it's like one of the things you gotta be careful about. People really, really like trees, and there's just huge attachment to planting trees. And absolutely, like planting in an urban area where it's paved is one thing, but thinking about, are you planting into grasslands? Because native grasslands are really threatened too. And in fact, probably native grasslands in California are more threatened than redwoods in some ways because they're super diverse and there are so few native grasslands left. And so that's one of those things that, you know, like the East Bay Hills were a mix of trees and grasslands. And so when you're going, I don't know the Northern California forest as well, but I think it's always important to think was what was there before too. And yeah, we're in a brave new world of like, what do we mean by restoration? It's huge in the restoration literature. Like, okay, what are we, the whole idea of novel ecosystems and like, are we moving things, you know, so yeah, there's a lot of kind of ethics in human restoration too.
All right, thank you. We had you in the front.
Yeah, two short questions. The first one was specifically for, sorry, I forgot your name.
Karen.
Karen. Do you think your experiments in tropical regions apply to temperate regions?
So that's a really good question. I think that so restoration is very site specific. And anytime we start making any generalities, we need to be testing those at different sites or not. The idea with the tree islands, I'm starting to see more and more tests of it. But I can tell you a really good example. A colleague of mine who's in Spain did oak restoration where you put them in islands. And 20 years later, they have not spread a bit, and that's because they have tons of herbivory at the edge. And so in that particular place, herbivory. So, like, and you can see it in our coastal grasslands here. If you look at the edge of like coyote brush patches, there'll be a really heavy rabbit herbivory and stuff like that. So, do I think that? So right now I'm thinking about, does it work in the tropics? It seems to work in the tropics pretty well. And can we try other places? But even within there, I think there are different things going on. It probably would work less so in systems where there's a lot of wind dispersed species because they're going to spread more evenly anyways. So I think it really depends, and it's really, really important to test strategies in given systems, in different systems to kind of see how can we generalize or not, and not just kind of going, let's make huge recommendations based on the project at a single site.
The second part was kind of to everyone, whether you're optimistic about agroforestry and food forests, either in the urban setting or in suburban settings, as either a place for relaxation or for actual food. I guess it's mainly directly towards you.
Yeah. I mean, I think that like food forests and food urban forests are a tenuous topic because a lot of people like want to have food sovereignty, and that is a very good thing. But you have to balance that with the maintenance requirements of having street trees that drop fruit and create litter that might cause slippage hazards or create a lot of rotting waste. And also, fruit trees require a different type of maintenance as urban trees. But I think that in backyards there's a lot of room for that. The one threat I think is we're talking about food sovereignty, environmental justice, and body loads of people who maybe already subsistence on a lot more fish than and you get more mercury. So thinking about what's in the soil in those urban environments and the historical uses might change the viability of how you actually plant those gardens, because you don't want your residents in the long term eating those heavy metals unless we can find a method of bioremediation that works beforehand. But that said, I think that there are a lot of traditional models of agroforestry and like the silvopastoral systems, like the history of those funky pollarded trees that look like the Whomping Willow in Harry Potter. Those are all because people used to graze underneath and then wanted to get like wicker for either basket making or cooking on top. So there's a lot of mechanisms and models from traditional societies in place that can show those like intercropping that could work in some density in suburban or urban areas, depending upon what your situation and site is.
All right, we got two more people on stack, and then we'll open up for more. We had you over here.
Hi, my question is pretty much like a follow-up for Hawkins. So I'm just generally wondering, like, what's the soil quality of San Francisco, urban soil quality of San Francisco, and how do you like, what kind of, if it's cool, how do you like get to like solve these kind of problems?
So
Could you repeat the question?
if what's the soil quality in San Francisco, and if it is poor, how do we work on remediating is your question, right? San Francisco has a lot of different soil qualities depending upon where you are. So the outer side is really sandy, so there's a lot of room for water infiltration, but it doesn't actually hold much water. So in that way, we have to amend the soil with compost or organic matter that can hold water or clay. On the east side, we have areas like Hunters Point that were traditional shipyards and industrial areas that are actually Superfund sites where people should not be living but are forced to live because of the historical migration patterns. And there, I would say you need to, either find good bioremediation techniques, whether it be the tules or sunflowers or tobacco, whatever you can grow to clean that soil first, or you have to build raised beds, which, a fruit tree needs a lot of root space. And then there's the rocky middle. There's also the problems like serpentine that might have asbestos in it and heavy metals. So most urban complexes just show up as urban complex on a map, on a USGS soil map. So until you get underneath that concrete and you see this compacted thing that hasn't been exposed to the air in about 100 years, you don't really know what you're working with.
Do you have a historical map of San Francisco? Like, because I get it.
We have some,
but,
yeah.
But like the dunes, if the sandy soils are dunes, then wouldn't it make more sense to plant shrubs or things that would be more dune associated as opposed to trying to mend them to put trees
Yeah,
over
we
there?
looked at Golden Gate Park.
Yeah. And that's actually,
Golden Gate Park, they have how many species that are thriving in pure sand, so.
They do,
They've
but my
built
point is,
that
that-
soil
so
over time.
could we be thinking about what the original habitat was in some cases and trying to pick the appropriate type of trees or plants?
and that's, I think, why in that Sunset in those areas we have moved more towards these like sidewalk landscape gardens, because they more mimic the natural, the natural ecology, and we're able to put more native plants there because historically San Francisco didn't have too many native tree species, and a lot of them are not very good as sidewalk trees. But we can put a lot of like the native shrubs that were there originally.
All right, okay.
I just wanted to know what you put on the seniors compost, stuff that's going to be composted and then turn black into a stick in one day. What was that called?
Okay, it's, you have to develop a recipe.
Okay.
For, because old folks tend to have more soupy stuff too. So there's recipes out there, but we had to create our own. So it's a third manure, a third wood chips, and a third food waste.
Well, no, what I was talking about is what made it turn black so it didn't stink. That's
Oh, the actinomyces.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, it's a
something
fungi.
you can buy.
Would you spell it, please?
Oh, ACTINOMYCETES. It's
So I can
a,
go to the farmer's market and say, here,
no, you can't buy it. No. It's all around us. You have to bring it out. And so the way you bring it out is to make an area that it can eat. So that's why you're making this recipe. So there's plenty of it out there. Whenever you get like a pile of wood, dig through it, that white stuff is actinomyces. It's what makes the earth smell earthy.
Smell.
That's where you
it's nice thing.
actinomyces. It's a bacteria.
Okay. All right, we have another question right there with the glasses.
Yeah, I have actually a question and an observation. Karen, I've been privileged to know about major tree planting areas that are more citizen, university, or nonprofit based. One is the Tree Sisters, which is planting 1 million trees. Another is 100,000 trees in Mozambique. And my question is are there any entities, perhaps out of the UN, that is kind of monitoring, well, who's doing some tree restoration, who's doing some tree planting, so that there's actually an opportunity to be able to see, well, how much carbon are we sequestering?
There's a lot of the NGOs like WRI, World Resource Institute, and then the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature. People are the carbon aspects that's probably what's best documented. People don't know the biodiversity effects of some of these as much, but there's a big planting there's the Great Green Wall, it's called. There's a huge tree planting effort in China too. Unfortunately, they are mostly planting non-native trees and often into their habitats not. But there's also another one in the Sahara they're trying to do but there are a bunch of organizations.
Monitors that?
There's a number of countries, forest like I said, some of those big, they're called big international NGOs do stuff like that, and they have a pretty good sense of kind of like what's going on as far as those go. Oftentimes there's also regional ones. Like I said, WRI is overseeing the 20 by 20 initiative in Latin America, so they're kind of figuring out where the bigger question is like how much they're committing versus how much they're actually doing. You know, there's that
Yes.
a big gap in that question to that one. So, but yeah, there's pretty good document, and people have a pretty good sense of it, I think. With some of
So
these
that's
things.
the first question, and the second observation is that I really want to thank Georgia for your advocacy. There are some of us, I've been an old growth advocate since I was 20, and that was 50 years ago. So there are some entities that I suggest you connect with, I'm sure you know about them, like the Tree Foundation, which is a completely integrated aggregate of, you know, almost everything with very, very capable advocates, law drafters, voices in Sacramento, you know, a lot of them. And if you're related at all with the Noe Valley activists 20 years ago, they're still all kicking and doing real well. So I'm really happy, I'm not really happy to hear what's happening. I'm furious at what's happening. But you do have elders and brothers and sisters who've been doing this for a very, very long time.
Yeah, that's actually one of my favorite things about working on this civic campaign is because you're working with people that have been out there for 20 years, like you said. I mean, I'm working with people that have been, that started fighting PL in '98 and they're still out there.
And if anybody wants a bonbon of a book to read Totem Salmon. It's right about that. It's about us actually doing land swaps so that we can revitalize a salmon river. It's really amazing.
To that, you in the red?
I have a question for you, Joyce. You mentioned that we have just a few years to get together with some of the higher global warming potential gases. And I think we just had Senate Bill 1383 signed last year to take care of some of that business. We don't have much time. So you've been doing composting for a while. Do you consider alternative methods? I'm thinking a little bit about biomass gasification, for example.
Well, we wanted to tie it into the restoration because there's so much work that could be done. You can use it, I calculated at least to do 200 acres, it's going to take 40 years to get that forested. And so why not use it directly into it and providing jobs for youth, getting people to understand what's going on. And it's cost efficient. We had to offset that $4,000. So $4,000 gives us a tractor and one young woman who does the major work. And so as these laws come in, we're hoping that these restaurants will ask us to take their stuff, and then we're working with Cal State East Bay. Possibly they have another 400 acres that you can use that whole South Diablo range successfully and reconstitute it. So, but we're just, I don't know, I ain't gonna be around, so.
You never know.
You never know.
All right. We have time for a few last questions. Let's go with him, and then we'll go to the back next.
Yeah, a lot of different geography to cover with trees, I'm thinking of, from the wildlands, the tropics, other ecosystems, all the way to the suburban, urban. How do we choose appropriate species? Where do we source them? What's ethical in the sense of restoration to what era? Will we be managing in traditional ways, like with fire? I mean, there's all these questions that come up with what ecosystems are we trying to create together that's appropriate, considering the history and where we're at now, economically, socially, ecologically.
I mean, that's a great question, because we had to deal with that, because as somebody had said before, that it's how you evolve. Our whole area has evolved using plate tectonics, put it like that. And so every time we have an earthquake,
the diagonal range is going higher, and it's causing shifts of climate, niche climates. And so we have to take that in consideration. What can we go back to? And so, and if we can't go back to that area, then we just can't do it, and we have to evolve into, I mean, we've all evolved. Because I know we also run a museum with, when the mastodons ran around here 5,000 years ago, you know, where are you bringing us back? And then if you go even in Calaveras, you had marine intrusions during, you know, 5 million years ago. So you got to figure out where can we do, how long is the human species even going to evolve? I mean, these are, I know we do not think in this going back to a native. There is no such thing. Native depending on to what. It's what your area can sustain is an important question, and I totally agree with you. It can't be a global. It has to be local people solving local problems and what they want out of it. I know for our group, we want to see the bald eagle come back. We've already seen the golden eagle come back. We want to see those bird species come back to the area, but we also realize because of the Hayward Fault and the Calaveras Fault that we cannot go back to, you know, 5,000 years ago. Cannot, because there was no diagonal range 5,000 years ago. You know, it was just starting to come, it started moving up about it's very, very complicated.
I'd say it's completely, it sort of gets back to the question about systematic restoration. There's a lot of ethics in restoration. When I teach restoration ecology, we spend the first couple of class not talking about ecology, but what are we trying to restore to? And there's huge debates in the literature. Are we trying to go back to 300 years ago prior to European colonization? Are we trying to go back, you know, 100 years? We often don't know what it's like. And so there's big debates in the literature. My philosophy on this is I think it's really important to be very clear what you're trying to do. You know, and each project has to say, I think it's good to, there's an important point to looking at what the historical map looks like, and then you make a decision. But you need to be honest. And if you're not even trying to, I mean, there's some projects out there that call themselves restoration that are completely shifting ecosystems to something else. And that's, I think, you need to at least be, okay, I'm planting a forest and a grassland, or I'm putting a eucalyptus plant, you know, I mean, you've got to be careful, but I think it's most important that you're transparent. What are my goals, and how am I going to get there? And the genetics thing is also like that. How local is local? There's no...
Native California is like
it really depends, and most people I know do the best they can, and that the best varies. If you're in San Francisco, obviously it's very different than if you're somewhere that has good nearby sources. So yeah, I don't think you can come up with broad rules of thumb. And there's no, I always tell my academic colleagues, there's no word police out there. So you guys can debate all you want about the terminology, and people are going to go out and do what they're going to do. So I'm just a big advocate about being transparent about what you do.
And to piggyback on that, I would say one of my favorite former professors would always just say, it depends on your objective. That's what, and you know, you have a clear objective, you have a clear defined goal, and you know, we as humans are really good ecosystem engineers. So what do we want that ecosystem to look like? One of the challenges we've seen in terms of sourcing is, you know, because a lot of landscape architects, a lot of nurseries, they grow stock based on their East Coast and European training. So it's very difficult to source native species, and even in San Francisco, because the land's so expensive and we have such a really cold microclimate, even native species that we get from places that are like 50, 30 miles away will not survive in our climate. And then, you know, balancing that with, like I was saying, all of the benefits that trees have versus green, like other green infrastructures, forests, grasslands, shrubs, and looking at the psychological benefits and weighing those. You know, do we want food production? Do we want a native representation? Do we want traditional ecological management to show all these, like, the histories of the people that live in the city now so they can be connected to their roots? Do we want the, like, you know, the psychological calming effects, and then going on from there as you do your work? Yeah.
But in the cities, you're also talking about the heat island effect. So you're also doing trees for that reason. So you can always, you know, that's always a big thing. So that's a different thing than the wildlands. So wildlands and cities are very different.
All right, well, we're getting really close to our time here, and we did have one woman in the back who had her hand up before.
Okay, I just had a question, as a parent. With your research of the test plot. Did you do succession planting, or you planted all at one time, and that's the result from one planting, or was it like over time?
The trees I'm planting?
Uh-huh.
We set up our experiment over a few, like, we planted certain plots in 2004, 2005, but in an individual site we planted in the same year. Our goal, working in tropical forests is a little bit different than in California. Well, there's a lot of very diverse California ecosystems, but when you're working in a forest that might have 100 trees per acre, tree species, sorry, you can't plant every species. So our goal was to facilitate recovery. So we planted a certain number of species, we clear around them for 2.5 years, let them grow up, and then we just let it go. And then the idea is to speed up succession. And I will say that I work in California too. It's a lot, California's ecosystems are much tougher in a way because you're just constantly battling exotics. Whereas there, if you, at least where I work, once you get the recovery process going, you're not going to get exactly what was there before, but you get the process going, and you can actually see like the forest developing. Particularly now that we're at year like 13 or 14, you can really see something going on. But our goal was not to plant all the species. It was to kind of get tree cover, shade out the grasses, and then have the birds and bats and everything else. And not carrying it on us. Yeah, well, just making it a good habitat for them, so they brought the rest. We're not going to.
Okay, we have a burning question and then we'll close it out.
Nobody
Okay.
has to answer it. Could we agree, whatever our goal and all the things that have been delineated, to do it without poison? That's it. That's the bottom line. Yeah. That's all.
All right, well, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.